What's up, Node.js developers? Welcome back to a new live stream. And today what we're gonna do is we're gonna connect the front end of Twitter that we have built in the previous episode with the backend that we have also built in the previous episode. So we're gonna put them together from React Native. We're gonna query our REST API that we have built using React Query. And also we're gonna implement the authentication screens in order to allow users to create an account and to sign in to use the application. So that's quickly the plan for today. If you haven't checked out the previous episodes, I will leave a link in the description. There are two very value-packed episodes. In the first one, we have built the Twitter UI in React Native using React Native Expo router. And here is the result of our first episode. I'll also provide the source code, so if you haven't checked it out, I will give you the code to be able to follow along from this moment. So yeah, this is what we have at the moment. We will also be able to create tweets, post there, go back, and so on. So this is our front end, and the code for it you can find in the description below. We're going to github/notjust.Dev/Twitter. Here is our application. I'll make sure to create a UI branch that will include only the code that we have at the moment. So if you're watching it afterwards, make sure that you're checking the UI branch. Actually, let me do it quickly right now. So git checkout -b UI and git push origin UI. And now all the code that we have at the moment is going to be in the UI branch here. Perfect. The second part, in the second episode, what we did was to create our API that will allow us to manage our users, manage our tweets, and also will authenticate users using passwordless authentication. This is a big part of a previous episode, so if you're interested in that, if you're interested how you can implement yourself authentication without passwords, only with emails and with one-time passwords that users receive on their email, then definitely check out the previous episode where we do that on the backend. We integrate, we create all the tokens, we send this email to the user, and today we're gonna connect it with our front end. So again, the backend is you will be able to find the backend also on our GitHub account, and it's called Twitter Backend. Just pull this repository and make sure to install the dependencies using npm install. And after that, we can do npm run dev. We need to run the development server to start receiving requests. And we see the server is ready, and I think also are ready to get started. Should I just zoom in a bit so you can see better? Yeah. I'm using also this extension that someone recommended me in the previous episode for Founder client that allows me to create these requests and test our API. So here are a couple of endpoints that we're gonna have to interact from our React Native application today. And for example, here, like if we look at the login, everything is going to start with this request. We're gonna send, we're gonna receive OK, and we're gonna receive an email on our account, on our email with a code that we can provide here to the email token. And after that, we would be able to do the rest of the queries like list tweets and so on. So that's quickly the plan. As well, today, as I said, we're gonna learn about React Query. This is something that I also started using recently, and I really enjoy working with React Query. Let's see how it will play in our React Native application today. And hello everyone in the chat. How are you doing, guys? Are you ready? Have you finished the previous episodes? Let me know. Hello from Tunisia. Hello. Ahmed, hello. Atlanta, India. By the way, guys, if you're enjoying our project-based builds, make sure to subscribe to the channel and be part of the 1%, because from our analytics, let me find that analytics to show you. From our analytics, here we have it. 98.5% of people are not subscribed. 98.5% of people watching this live stream are not subscribed. So please, if you're enjoying what you're seeing here, if you're taking some value, if you're learning something new, make sure to subscribe to the channel and write in the comments like I'm part of 1%, and we will know that you're supporting us and making sure to help us reach more developers. Hey Momo, thank you very much for the donation. Okay, so where do we start? Let's start not from the authentication, but let's actually start with some queries. And the most important query in our application here is this list tweets query that will give us all the tweets. So if I go to the backend, the list tweets query is this one. And if I would try to send the request right now, we get an error back that our API token is expired. So we would have to generate a new API token. And how do we do that? We do that by following the login flow. So firstly, we send a login request. Then on our email, we should receive the token, the email token, which we can provide to the authenticate here. So let me quickly check the email token, or actually I'm also, where is it? Yeah, if I open the logs, here is the email token that I'm console logging, but I also receive it on email. So if I do send right now, we get back an authentication token that we can sign all the future requests like list tweets. So going back to the list tweets, we can go into the authentication here and we can replace the authentication token like this. And if I send right now, as you can see, we get back an array of tweets. So this is exactly what we're going to have to do from our React Native application. On our feed screen, and before I get into that, I'll quickly show you how to fix this issue with where the first screen says that it doesn't exist and we have to go back to the feed. I was trying to fix this issue in the previous live stream for quite a bit, but the fix is very straightforward actually. So what our application is missing is the home screen. The home screen basically should be the index.tsx file inside our application folder. This is because we are using export router and the home page should be the index.tsx. So it should be there, but the problem is that we want our home screen to be the feed. So the feed is inside drawer, tabs, feed, and here index. So that's why I was not creating this index, because I wanted our feed to be home screen, not some other page. But actually, what we can do here is we can export default, I don't know, index, the component. And here, inside the component, we can simply do a redirect using a component redirect from export router to the href that we need. So the href that we need is drawer is inside the parentheses, so it is not part of the href. Tabs is not part of the href. Feed, so /feed, and we need feed index. So we're gonna stop here. What's going on here? Export default function index and redirect to feed. Now if I'm gonna refresh the page, it's gonna go to the index, but the index will redirect to the feed. And this index should always be here, because if we are sending a deep link to the root of our application, we should somehow handle it. So that's why we need the index that will redirect to the feed. Perfect. So I can even do git add. Like this. Okay, so now going back in our application folder, this is where all our screens from the application live. Let's go to the drawer, tabs, feed, and here in the index is where we have our flat list with tweets. At the moment, these tweets are coming from dummy data, but what we want to do is we actually want to get these tweets from our API. Let's see. Yeah, as usual, I will try to do everything like in this screen to not confuse you with a lot of files. And then we're gonna start extracting logic in different files to separate concerns and to keep everything clean. So where do we start from? First of all, because we have, because we will query our API, the result is going to be stored back into a state variable. So all the tweets that we have here imported from the assets, instead of being there, we're going to define a state variable for tweets and set tweets, which is equal to use state and an empty array. Now we can go ahead and comment out the import from the dummy data, and our home feed should be empty because now the tweets are an empty array. Okay, the next step is when do we want to query our API? We want to query the API as soon as this screen, which is tab 1 screen, but probably it's better to rename it as feed screen. As soon as this feed screen component mounts. So for that we need a use effect like this, use effect with an empty array as a dependency array to make sure that this use effect only is being called once when we mount the component. So what do we need to do here? Well, we're going to have a function fetch tweets, which is going to be an async function. In this fetch tweets, we're going to have to actually fetch the tweets. And let's make sure that we are calling this function right away. Okay, perfect. Now we have to send an HTTP request in a similar way as how we did here with the Thunder client to our server. At the moment, our server is running at localhost 3000, so make sure that it is running and you can send this request from your Thunder client. And now our next step is to actually send a request to this URL. So let's get this URL, come back in our React Native, and fetch tweets from basically this local host. How do we do that? There are a couple of ways to fetch an REST API, basically to send HTTP requests. Some of them are using external libraries like Axios, but there is a method that doesn't require us to install any third-party libraries and is part of them. Is pre-built, so we have access to it. And here I'm talking about the fetch API. So this fetch API allows us to send HTTP requests. Where let's do const URL equal, let's call this, put this URL that we want to fetch here, and let's do URL here. Now, what we can do is we can get the result by awaiting this fetch request. Let's go ahead and do console log result to see what we get back. Now, if I'm going to open the terminal, to find our Metro bundler. Somewhere in these results, we see this log. And if we look throughout this log, we see status 401. Status 401 is for requests that are not authorized. So what does that mean? It means that we sent basically we're not authorized to access the API because we haven't provided the authorization key. How do we provide authorization key? We can do that by providing a header. So if we send to the fetch API extra options here, we can pass here some headers. And some of the headers that we are interested in, and if we look at our API in the middlewares of middleware, we see that we are depend on the authorization header. So let's take this authorization header. I think we need to capitalize it. And here in the authorization header, we need to send actually let's send a template string because the authorization header will contain the word bearer and then the token, the authentication token. At the moment, we don't have authentication token here in the application managed automatically. We're going to do that when we implement authentication, but let's as well store it into a variable, hard-code it from our API here where we authenticated, or you can look even in the database for an authentication token. But I'm going to take it from here, from the last request we made to the authenticate endpoint. And if we put this authentication token here, now let's open up here and try to reload our application to see if we still have this error. No, we don't. And I see that the status code at the moment is 200. So right away, as you can see, we can do some error handling based on this status code. So we can do if response.status is different than 200, then let's do, I don't know. We can alert or do some actions, but actually I don't really care that much here because we're gonna change the place for this and it's going to be a bit different. Error fetching the API. But how do we get access to the actual data of the tweets, these tweets? Well, we do that by accessing the response.json, and this is where we're going to get our tweets. So what we can do is we can right away set in our state the tweets as response.json. We need to call this function. And if I refresh, nothing is happening because response.json, let's have a look at the console log here. Possible type error already read, oh, because we have two of them. So let's do it like this, const data equal response.json. Let's console log the data here and let's set it in state. And we see that when we see an error like this, it usually means that we forgot to await a promise. And this response.json is a promise, so we need to make sure to await. So because of that, it didn't show up. But now, as we can see, we have our first tweets from our database in our feed. And to show that it's actually coming from the database, we can go to the backend and we can run npx Prisma Studio, and that will open Prisma Studio for us to explore our database. So if I'm gonna bring it here, in the tweet, we see all of these 6 tweets that we see on the screen here. They match our database. Perfect. Just wanted to ask, is your programming course in TypeScript? The full stack mobile development course, we have their projects that are using JavaScript, and they are targeted at beginners that are just getting started with React Native. But as we gain more experience, the main project of a course is actually using TypeScript, and there, like you teach, you learn everything. You learn to build full stack mobile applications using TypeScript. So the answer is both TypeScript and JavaScript. And if you're interested to learn more about mobile development, and if you are serious about becoming a full stack mobile developer, make sure to check out our premium course, link in the description, where you can go at academy.notjust.dev. Yes, thank you for the question. Hello from Sri Lanka. Hello. Okay, so let's go ahead and here, I think code is too huge, like I cannot fit it on the screen. So what I want you to do now is all of this fetching logic is low-level logic of interacting with the API. So it's kind of not recommended to keep querying logic, and specifically this low-level logic of dealing with auth tokens, with the headers and so on, to keep it together with your high-level components that are simply rendering flat list of tweets that are responsible for the UI. So what I want to do is I want to separate the querying logic into some separate files. And for that, let's go ahead and create a new folder. Let's create a new folder, lib, where we will keep all our internal libraries. And inside the lib, I can create a folder API where we will keep all our API interactions files. In this API, let's go ahead and create the tweets.ts. And here is where we will store functions that will do API requests. So the function that we want to do first, let's export it from here, like list tweets. It's an async function. And everything here, like the logic, what should the logic be? We already defined the logic. So it should be something like this, like the fetch tweets. So let's copy most of the things from here, basically the body of this function from here, and bring them to our new library file, like this. We're not done yet because there are still some things we have to change. For example, here instead of set tweets, what we want to do is we want to return this data. So let's delete this from here and let's simply return it here. Return. Also, instead of console logging here, I would rather throw a new error here, but we're gonna need that a bit later, so I'm gonna explain why. Throw new error, and here error fetching, let's be a bit more specific, fetching tweets, like this. Now, back in our feed, what we can do here is let's import the list tweets function from the library API tweet. And inside our fetch tweets function, let's go ahead and const response equal list tweets. We need to await, of course. And after we get that result, we can set it in state set tweets as response. So now if I refresh, everything should still be working like this, but now in our feed screen, we don't have low-level logic of how is the fetching happening. We only are calling that function. Still, this is not perfect. We're gonna get there step by step, but I want to go back here to twist.ts and make sure that we still extract some of the things from here. For example, the URL that we will fetch, I will extract it from outside of this function as the API URL. And I'm not gonna put all the URL, but only the main part of a URL. So this part of a URL. Now the URL that I want, because this part is going to be reused and it's going to be the same for all the requests. So I don't want to repeat over and over again. And moreover, this part of a URL is the part that most probably will change depending on where you host the API. But everything that is after, this is not going to change no matter in what environment you are running your API, being it locally, with localhost, or hosted somewhere. So that's why I extracted the API URL outside. And now for the URL itself, I don't even need it here. I will go ahead and compose it inside the fetch function with a template string here, because the first part should be the API URL. Then we have /tweets or /tweet. The authentication token, I can extract it right now as well. We will change how this works later, but for now, let's keep it here. Yes, and here I can remove this comment, and the function is much more, it's cleaner. And now, yeah, I think one more extra step is to extract this API URL to a configuration file, because again, it's not only going to be used in this file, but in other API files as well. So I don't know, you can have in the API a config.ts that will contain API configuration. And let's move both of these variables here and add export in front of them. Export. Come on. Like this. Now back in our tweets, we can go ahead and import API URL and auth token from config. Now it's going to be even easier when we add more files, because if we want to change the API or the authentication token, we're going to have to change it only in one place. All right, so with our fetching logic, we are complete. Vadim, how to host this local server? If you're interested in how to host, I was thinking about a separate video in this series where I can show you how to host this server in the cloud using AWS on an EC2 instance, and also how to use a cloud database that is going to be a Postgres SQL database. So if you're interested in this part of a backend of deploying and actually making it available in production, then let me know in the comments, and probably we're going to do it in the following weeks. The next 2 weeks, I'm not going to be home. I'm traveling to Krakow to App.js conference. So if you're there, let me know. I would love to meet our community. But when I get back, we can get back and do the deployment. Okay, so our next step. Let's go back in our screen, in the feed screen index here, and see how we are doing the logic of calling this fetch function and other important stuff here. At the moment, doing it this way, it's still not a huge problem. But if you would like to add some basic functionalities that you'd expect from any application, like displaying a loading state when we are fetching the tweets, or displaying the error when something happens, or refetching the same query, or managing the pagination, or managing or caching the result in order to not send this request over and over if we already have this data. So if you would have to implement that yourself, you would quickly understand how complex this part is of managing API remote data in your application. So in a lot of cases, developers are creating their own pseudo libraries for doing that. Or the alternative is to use an existing library that is specifically designed for that. For this project, what we're going to use is React query. So let's open it up. We're going to need to work with the documentation today because it's something new for me as well. So React query is, as we can see, is a powerful state management library for React application. And specifically, state management that handles remote data from the server. I think it's gonna make more sense as we get our hands dirty and start using it. So let's go ahead in the documentation, in the installation guide, and I'm gonna go with a version 4 actually, instead of version 3. Version 5 is still in alpha, so I'm gonna keep it with version 4. Let's start by installing React query library in our application. So in our React Native application, I'm going to run npm i 10stack/react query. And after that is done, what we have to do is we have to wrap our application with a React query client. If you are familiar with React Native, like before React Router, you might expect something like a app.js or app.tsx. That would be like the root file, the entry point of our application. And that's where we have all our context providers. In Expo Router, the entry point or the root part of our application is managed by the root layout. By the file _layout from the application directory. If we open it up, here is where we can, as you can see, here is where we can do like theme providers or other client providers that we have to make available to the whole of our application, to every single screen in our application. So what we have to do here, let's go ahead and import the client provider. So let me query client. So we have to import from TAN-stack React query the client, query client, and query client provider. This one. So the first step is to create the client. So client equal query client. It should be new. So client equal to new query client. And if we scroll down until we go to the root layout navigation, what we have to do is we have to wrap all of these components inside our query client provider. Let's close it at the end here. And we have to provide here the client that we created at the top. So client. Okay. Now we have access to our React query client in all our screens. We can close this layout file and go back to our feed component from the app drawer tabs feed index. Here, instead of managing everything ourselves like a state and like use effect and so on, I'm gonna comment it out to still have it here on the screen. But what we're gonna do is we're gonna use a hook called useQuery from React Query library that allows us to run queries. useQuery from Timestack React Query. So let's go ahead and see how to work with a useQuery hook. The useQuery expects some options, and the two important options here is the key, which is query key, and this query key is an array of strings. Let's call this tweets, and in a moment I'm going to explain what this query key is. And the second part is function, is query function, query fn. The query fn should be the asynchronous function that we want to call in order to query our backend. The particular thing about React Query is that it is agnostic of what backend you're using. So it really doesn't care like how you're querying your backend, as long as you're providing an async function that will return data. So we already have that async function, which is called list tweets from our library, that is doing this fetching of our API. So this should be our query function, list tweets from our library API tweets. Okay, back from useQuery, we get, first of all, data, and this data we can send to the flat list like this. And just like that, we replaced all of this code with a couple of lines of code to query our API. But it doesn't stop here. With useQuery, all of them features that I was talking about before, like error handling, loading states, retry, refresh, and so on, this is handled automatically by the React query. So the only thing that we should do is to get this, for example, is loading from the useQuery, and in our UI say like, if our query is still loading, let's go ahead and return an activity indicator to make sure that we are showing some visual feedback to the user that, hey, wait a bit, we are doing the request. If I save and refresh, this loading indicator will appear there, but for a very small amount of time because the server is running on the same machine, so the query goes very, very fast. But if it would take a bit longer, or I would have a slower internet on the device, this loading indicator would be very important for the user experience of our application. And we don't have to manage it ourselves with separate state variables. It's managed by the useQuery. The same goes with the error. So error here. So what we can do here is say if error, then let's return at the moment a text with error.message. Make sure to import the text from React Native here at the top. And you can style it better, but I just simply showed it in a text box. And what I can do to simulate an error is I can go to our library here, and maybe I can actually go to the config of our library to remove the API key. So this request, what it will do, it will return an error because we are not authenticated. Here we can see very well the loading indicator. And after a bit of time, what we should see is the error fetching tweets. And this is where the throwing of a new error is coming handy, because that's how the error from our library reaches the error from the use query. Other libraries other libraries like Axios, whenever the status code is going to be other than an OK status code like 200 or 201, those libraries will actually throw an error, but the fetch does not throw an error. So that's why we have to manually check the status code and to provide the errors here. And you can be more granular, like you can add a different status code here, like if status code is equal to 401, then not authorized. Please sign in, for example. So we're gonna specifically check, like if it's 401, it's not authorized. If it's not 200, like there is an error, but we don't know what. And if everything is okay, then return response.json. So if I'm gonna refresh now, we should be able to see this not authorized. Yes, exactly, that's what we see here. So back in our config, I'm gonna do Ctrl-Z to make sure that our requests are working. And I think I should refresh it actually. And we are back to our screen with data that we get from the server. Well, one more thing is about this query key. This query key is an identifier of this query that will help React query manage the cache, how it will cache the result of this query. So the next time in other parts of application, if we're gonna do the same another query with the same key, tweets, then basically the React query will cache it into the same array. So basically it will override the previous data that happens in another screen. And it's powerful when data changes in multiple places of a screen. This will help you maintain the same data without having to fully reload it. So for example, if you change the tweet here and then you go to that tweet screen, that is not yet implemented, but we're going to do that in a moment, the data will be the same when we are using the same query key. It's also important to mention that we can add multiple query fields here. So for example, we can say tweets and we can provide here another string, and the response will be cached based on the combination of this key. What we can also do is provide objects here, so any data that is serializable can be provided here. So for example, if we're doing a query for the tweets that also include some kind of filtering, we can provide here filter my tweets, and this is going to be different than the query that only queries the tweets, because it also will include some other fields like filter. Okay, in a moment we're gonna see one more way of how to add variables to this query key. Why do you use query lib? I use query, which is the React query library. Helps us, as I was saying so far, helps us query and manage the state of our application when the data is coming from our API. So instead of doing everything ourselves, which is in this comment here, which only handles the minimum amount of logic, what we do is using the use query, we can do everything much easier. And also it has a lot of added benefits behind the scenes, like caching and other important features that you need whenever you're working with remote data coming from your API. So if you're interested, check out the documentation. We have like a guide here somewhere at the top, like where? Should be in the docs. We had a page with motivation and I don't see it anymore. Yeah, here on the home there is motivation, and they explain pretty well why you would need to use React Query. Okay, perfect. So let's go ahead and do git add here, because we have commit -m set up React Query and fetch tweets. This is the first step. The next step, whenever we press on one of these tweets, we are going to the tweet detail page. So what that means is that we are opening the page from this tweet directory with ID, and at the moment it's looking through the dummy data. Instead of that, what we will have to do is to actually send a request to our server, because on our server, if we look in our Thunder client, we have a request to get a query by ID. So if we send this send, API token is expired, but yeah, I have to probably change it. So let's go ahead in our lib API. Let's start with the logic of fetching the data from the server. So for that, let's export const get tweet. It's going to be an async function. And also we're going to receive the ID of a tweet that we want to query. This ID is going to be string. Let's start by let's go ahead and be a bit lazy and copy paste the code from list tweets, because here what we will want to do is also we will use fetch API to query the API /tweet, but at the end, besides /tweet will return us a list of tweets, but if we do /tweet/ID, that's going to be only one tweet. So let's go ahead and add a slash here with a variable ID. We're including the authorization token. We're doing some basic error handling. And at the end, we are parsing it to JSON. Perfect, that's everything that we need here. So now let's go ahead and open the drawer, tabs, feed, tweet, ID. And this is the page that renders one tweet. What we're going to need here, we're going to need the use query from Tanstack React query. We're going to need the get query API method. So that's going to be not get query, get tweet from lib API tweets. And putting them together, what we can do is we can use query. Here, we need to provide the query key, which should be, as I said, an array of strings or other data types like objects. So I can say here it's tweet, and we can also add the ID here, because we want every single tweet to be uniquely identified in our cache. If we only provide the tweet here, whenever we go to a different one, it will override the previous tweet. So that's why we need here the ID to make sure that tweets with different IDs are cached in different places, like separately. And the query function will be get tweet. Get tweet expects an ID, so we can define here a function and send to the tweet the ID. ID here can be string or undefined and so on. I can do as string. And what do we get back? Let's get back data is loading and maybe error. We're not going to have to find the tweet through the dummy data, and also we can remove the import of that tweet. Let's do if is loading, then return the activity indicator that will show a spinner. Let's do if error, then return tweet not found. Otherwise, let's render the component tweet with the data that we get back from our API. So now if I press on this one, my first tweet from Thunder client, if I go back by pressing on this feed, and if I open something else, how are you guys? And the cool thing, the best thing that probably I can show you here is if I take our backend from here, move it to the other screen, close to our iOS device, and if I go to the tweet routes and inside the list tweets, no, inside the get one tweet, if I go ahead and say console log query tweet with ID, and here let's say ID. I will add this console log in order for us to see how many times is our server actually invoked when we are using our application. So let's go ahead and press on the, actually let me refresh the React Native application and press on the first tweet. If I do that, we see query tweet with ID 1. Okay, that's expected because it's the first time we are opening a tweet. If I go back to the home screen, go to the second one, we see query tweet with ID 2. Okay, perfect. If I go back and go to the first one, it still comes here. I don't know why, because I was actually expecting it to take it from cache and actually not have to query it. But it doesn't happen. So my expectation didn't meet the reality. Why is that happening? Why it's not taking it from cache? I'm afraid that we will get into complication here, but let me check the fetch policy. Let me look through the documentation for a bit. Network mode. Online. Offline first. This mode is the middle ground between the first two options. Caching. Let's see the caching. Basic. The caching example is writing the story and life cycle of. I think we have to configure it. Yeah, since no other queries, this query will show hard reloading state and make a network request. Since the cache already exists, the data is immediately returned, but it also triggers a new network request. Okay, so I understand how this caching works. It actually will not prevent the cache to reach the server, but what it will do, if it already has data in the cache, it will display the data without showing a loading indicator. Behind the scenes, it will send the request to the server, wait for updates, then receive updates, update the cache, and update the UI. So it will not prevent the request to reach the server multiple times, but it will make the UI look much more snappier, because if it already has some data, if it's not the first time, it will not show that loading indicator. So I think I can show that with in the tweet route. If I somehow do in the get one tweet here, if I somehow wait for a bit. Let's, for example, I will do set timeout 2 seconds, and only then I will do response JSON. Not sure if it will work actually, and it should be the second one. You don't have to do this. I'm just trying to simulate a very long request. So now if I go back here and open a tweet that has not been opened before, 1, 2, and then we should see the data. You see a very long loading state. This simulated a long request. So when it's the first time we are opening that tweet, we are seeing the loading indicator. If I go back and open a tweet that was already opened, it will show the data that is already in the cache. Behind the scenes, it will do a request to the server and will update the UI. And we can see that if I go to the Prisma Studio, and for the first tweet, my first tweet from Thunder, if I update here, updated, the text to updated, and save one change. If I'm gonna press on this tweet, we should first see the my first tweet from Thunder client, and then in 2 seconds we should see the updated, because the query behind the scenes is running, gets back, and we see updated there. So I hope that makes clear like how caching works. And yeah, it's, I think, very powerful to make sure that we are providing a better user experience. Let me move back this one here. And we are ready to, yeah, we are ready probably to move to the next part. But I need to make sure to remove that set timeout from the backend, not to take a lot of time. A quick tip, if you're working for a client, you can add this set timeout. And after 2 months, go ahead and tell them like, hey, I improved the performance of a server, so now the queries are much more faster, and you can charge extra for that. But don't say where you got this tip from. Okay, let me go ahead and do git add fetch one tweet. Perfect. Hello, Rogelio. Thank you. I appreciate that. Matt is saying, this is the most proper Twitter clone tutorial ever. Keep up the great work. I'm going to eventually purchase one of your products. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. I'm happy that you guys love that we go really in depth here. If you have multiple APIs to fetch, how can I fetch all of them in React query? Well, as I said, the React query is really backend agnostic. So it doesn't care where you get your data from, because at the end of the day, like what you have to do is you should provide an asynchronous function to the query function that will do the logic of querying. So in our case, we created this library that is using the fetch API to do the requests. You can also use Axios to do the request. You can use other libraries to do the actual requests, because what React query is doing, it's only managing the state of our data once it reaches our device. Hopefully that answers your questions. But if you say that you have multiple APIs to fetch, what I actually would recommend, what would be better, is to merge them together into one single GraphQL API. And you can do that using StepZen. We have actually a tutorial on that. It's the building a books project in React Native. And that project is using StepZen in order to merge multiple APIs together and generate a GraphQL API out of different parts. For example, in that project, we're querying data from Books API and also from Google Books and from some other API. So if you have the same use case, like I would rather recommend you to create one single API using StepZen out of every single APIs that you have there, and then from your application is going to be much more easier to query the data. Okay, so what do we have here? We are querying the tweets, we are querying the single tweet. The next step is to create tweets, right? Because, yeah, when we write something here, we should be able to create new tweets. In our backend, that is handled by the post request create tweet. As you can see, the only required field that we have to send to this request is the content, and it's handled by doing a post request to our /tweet endpoint. Let's go ahead and in the tweets start with creating the function that will do this request. I can go ahead and copy paste a function like getTweet, and let's call it create tweet. The data that it will receive is going to be, let's say, data, and the structure, the type of it is going to be an object where it will contain content of type string. Content. It might also contain like images and other data, but let's start with simply content. Now, what we have to do is to do a fetch request on the API URL /tweet. We don't need the ID here. And to make it a post request, we have to send here another option method using post. method post authorization, and then what else? The body, right? And the body is going to be our data, but we have to stringify it. So JSON stringify data as the body containing all the data that we want to send to the server. Okay. Error creating tweet, and then we can return response to JSON. Okay, let's see. Let's go ahead in our application, and here we have a new tweet screen that contains this onPress event. Now, previously we saw how to work with queries. Queries are helping us get data from the server. Whenever we have to send data to the server, and whenever we have to update things, like creating new tweets or updating a tweet or deleting a tweet, in that case, we should use mutations. So let's go ahead and get the hook use mutation from TAN-stack React query. And in our component new tweet here, let's go ahead and using our mutation, use mutation. What we should do is we should provide here options with the mutation function. The mutation function will be our create tweet function that in my case was imported from automatically from the lib API tweets, the function that we just defined here in our library. Okay, I don't need here the arrow, the mutation. Now, back from the mutation, we're going to receive a couple of functions. For example, one of them is the mutate function. Then we also will receive a is loading and is error. What we should do is here, when the user presses on this button, on tweet press, let's go ahead and call the mutate function to send the request to our server. Here we need, as we can see from the TypeScript, we need to send variables with the content. And the content is going to be our text that user wrote in the input box. So mutate context text. Now here we can say, let's show some kind of a loading indicator. I can do that in between the cancel and tweet button. And let's say if it's loading, then let's show an activity indicator. If it's loading and show the activity indicator. For the error, yeah, maybe I can do it somewhere here or even below the input container. Let's say if let's do if error. And I'm going to display it with a text error.message. What's wrong here? Did you mean is error? There is also is error, which is a boolean, but there is also the error. So we could work with both, like here to check if it's error and here to render the error message. Now let's go ahead and try it. But I'm gonna go ahead and comment out this set text and router back in order not to navigate back from this screen. New tweet from the application. If I press tweet, error creating a tweet. Why? We can go ahead and error creating a tweet. I think creating a tweet gives us back the status code 201. No, it's 200. Then what's going on here? Let's do console log response to see what response do we get from the server. Tweet status 400. Is it because of the because we didn't provide the content type here? So content type application/JSON. I think it worked, or no? Let me check the studio. New tweet from the application. So that means that it worked. Let's try one more time. If I go here and say testing tweet, I think it worked. Testing, it's here. And we don't have any errors. So yeah, the problem was we had to specify the content type, which should be application/JSON when sending the fetch request. Okay, back to our application here. So what do we do with this router back? Because if we add it here, the thing is that after executing this mutate, which is synchronous function, it doesn't mean that it automatically succeeded. It means that we send the mutation, but we don't know yet, like we should still wait. So doing it right away here, it's going to automatically redirect us back without waiting for a response. What we can do is either we can add a use effect based on the is success to check like if is success was received as true, then we can go back, or we can work with a mutate async. And this mutate async is an asynchronous function that we can await, and we can put it into a try catch, because if we await it can also throw an error. Async. And if everything worked okay after the wait, then we can update the text and navigate back. And here we can add a catch that can simply console log the error, because still the error is going to be received here from the use mutation as well. So here, testing now, if I do tweet, we see loading, and then when we receive it back, we right away are navigated back. So I can delete the try from there, and that's everything that we need here in this part. We don't need this is success, and yes, that's how we are creating new tweets, as we can see here. What you might also be interested in, for example, update the feed. If I tweet this update the feed, you want to go back and probably you will want to see the update feed somewhere here. What we can do is, let's check the documentation. We can invalidate some queries when we run some mutations. For example, updating a tweet should invalidate the query that got the data for that tweet. And here, like creating a new tweet should invalidate the feed. So one way would be to query invalidation. We can run query client invalidate queries and to pass there the query key of the query that we want to invalidate. And where do we do that? We can do that in the from mutation on success. So for the use mutation, we can provide here a on success function. Then using the query client that we have to get here at the top, query client, use client. Is it use client or use query client? Let's see. Import it from React query, probably use query client. Yes. So what we can do is when the mutation succeeds, we can invalidate the query with the key tweets, right? Because if we look at the drawer tabs feed index, here our query key is tweet. So now if I'm gonna do, now it should invalidate the feed query and display this tweet. If I do tweet, I go back, and if I scroll down, right away we see the new tweet here at the bottom. Now it should invalidate the feed query and display the tweet. So this way, whenever something happens and we know that some data will change in our application, we can invalidate that one, and when going back, it will do another request to the server to update it. But that's not the only way, because we can also do updates from the mutation response. So instead of completely invalidating all the feed here, what we actually want to do is we only want to add a tweet to that array of tweets, because we don't want to query all of them. Imagine having hundreds of pages of loaded tweets. You don't want to invalidate all of them, because it doesn't mean that creating a new tweet changed somehow the other tweets. It only added a new one to that array. So what we can do is on success, we can set query data with the data that we want. Also with the client, yes. So here in the new tweet, query client, we can set, instead of calling invalidate queries, which I will leave it here, we can set query data. Query key is this one, and the function is going to be updater. So existing tweets, and we should return a new array with the updated thing. So on success will also receive data here. So what we can do is we can return a new array where we put data first and then all the other existing tweets, and this way the new tweet will be at the top, right? I don't know, let's see. Let me see, set query data. You can do it like this, or you can also hold the data. But it can also be let's see, existing tweets. The array of representing the key. Oh, it's a bit different. So it doesn't have this query. It just has the array representing the key. Is it? Set query data key, and then a function that updates it. Array. in then the function, which is unknown. Okay, let's see. Might be simply a problem with types, but it might work actually. So here, if I refresh, have everything like this, should be displayed at the top of the feed. If I tweet it, go back, no, cannot read property image of undefined. On success data exit. Let me go ahead and do a proper function that will return this. And here I want to do console log data and console log existing without destructuring. Let me just do it like this. Oh, not here. Yeah. So okay, there is updated 1, 2, 3 tweet, and what do we see there? Data is the data of a newly posted tweet, and existing is an array of data. Oh, I know. The newly posted tweet does not include the user that posted it. So what I can do, I can go back to my backend for the tweet route. When we post a new tweet, create tweet, I can also tweet create. I can also include the user of this data to make sure that when we return it back, it returns the user of the tweet as well, because that's what we need to automatically insert it in the feed. User data tweet, and we see that it right away is displayed here as user data. Perfect. It doesn't have a name because my newly created account with an email Vadim Savin does not have a name in our database. So that's the only reason why. If I add the name here and change it like this, what? What's going on? Okay, this one. Vadim, save, update, and the data should work. Yeah, the last one is Vadim. And if I do new one, send, at the top of our feed, it says new one. Perfect. So we saw two ways of automatically updating our queries based on some mutations that we are running, using the invalidate queries, which will simply invalidate the query, and the next time we go there, it will do a new request to the server, or by writing automatically data that changed in the existing queries that we have. Amazing. Let me go ahead and, oh, why did I stop the server? Create tweet mutation. I forgot to add. Yes. And that is how we can run mutations and send data, create things on our server. Okay, what else? I think we are mostly done with basic query and mutation. I showed you how we can query list of items. I showed how we can query one item by ID, how we can do mutations, how we can invalidate, how the cache is working. And with that being said, I think it's time to get into the authentication. The authentication is going to be interesting, and it's going to take a bit of time to implement and explain everything. So really excited about that. What do you guys say? How is it going so far? John, no, I haven't worked with gRPC. Hello, this example keeps session active even when you close the application. We haven't implemented authentication yet, but we're gonna do that, and also we're gonna make sure that we keep the session active even when you close the application. Can you use Axios for gRPC requests? Not sure about gRPC, but you can use Axios with React Query. Thank you very much. All right. Is TypeScript required, or can I watch it with very basic TypeScript knowledge? You can definitely watch it and follow along with basic TypeScript knowledge. If you understand what part is the TypeScript, you can simply ignore that if you don't want to use it and continue using JavaScript. It's as simple as that. Okay. So next step, authentication. Let me just bring some water, and then we are gonna get into the authentication. All right. Ты кодишь стоя. Да, я кодю стоя. Yes, gives me a bit more energy. All right, so let's get into the user interface of our passwordless authentication flow. What we have to do is we have to develop two screens in our application. One that will start the request, that will request a one-time password, and the second one where the user will be able to input the one-time password and receive the JWT token that the application is going to use to further sign requests that he's going to make to our server. So yeah, let's start by developing these two screens, the user interface, then we're gonna make the requests, and lastly, we're gonna make the logic of handling, protecting our routes, and handling the authentication flows. So in our application, what we have to do is, let's open our app directory, and again, like for this application that I'm using for this demo, we are using Expo Router, but if your application is using something else, you can completely use a different rack navigation as well, for example. So let's go ahead and here create a new group of files that will handle the authentication. So let's create a new folder, auth, and here we're gonna have two screens. One of them, let's say sign in screen, sign in.tsx, and the other one is going to be the second screen that where users can input the email code. So on the backend, we call that authenticate.tsx. So let's keep it the same. Let's define two basic components here, React Native Functional Export, and here React Native Functional Export. Should be capital. Same here. As a temporary solution, in the index.tsx, I'm going to redirect actually to our sign in page in order to see it always on the screen. So if I'm gonna refresh right now, we should be redirected to the sign in, and here we see this sign in text. Okay, so on this sign-in page, what we need is, we need two things. We need one text field where the user will be able to input the email, and a button where he's going to, that he'll press to start the flow. So let's go ahead and start with a text input. So define a text input. And here for the placeholder, we're gonna use email. Let's make sure to import text input from React Native like this. Why is the feed displayed there? Okay, sign in. And for the text, let's do sign in or create an account, because this flow will both sign the user in or will create an account if he doesn't have one. Create an account. Lastly, what we're gonna need is a button at the bottom. So let's use a pressable component from React Native, and inside the pressable a text saying sign in. Like this. Okay, for the styles, I'm gonna go ahead and provide you with all the styles that you need. So you not to waste time on the styles, like it's pretty basic, but still it would take us a lot of time. So style sheet here. And let's go ahead and provide to the top view styles.container. Then for the text, style.label. For the text input, let's give input. Pressable will be style dot button, and lastly here button text. And just like that, we have a pretty simple page where we can write our email. That's not everything, because we have to bind a state variable to this text input to get the email that user is typing. So for that, we're going to define the email state. Come on, buddy. And initially it's going to be an empty string. Let's make sure to import useState from React, and the email value we're going to send to our text input as value. So let's say value equal to email, and on change text is going to call our setter. So every time we change the text, it's going to update the state variable. Now, if I write, yes, everything is working. And the pressable will call a function that we have to define here. So let's do on sign in. It's going to be an async function that at the moment, let's simply console warn sign in, and maybe even the email. Let's make sure that whenever we press on this pressable, we call the on sign in function. Now, if I write my email here, press sign in, we see my email at the bottom. So with a user interface for our sign-in page, I think we are done. So let's go ahead and copy everything and move everything to authentication as well. Because the authentication is going to be another page that instead of requesting the email, it will request the user code. So what I will do is, in the index, let's do the redirect to the /authenticate to make sure to see it here on the screen. And inside the authentication, let's start by changing the state variable from email to code, set code. And here the user will be redirected automatically, and he will be able to authenticate using this code. The text input, the placeholder will be email code, set code, and confirm your email. Maybe you can provide extra details like, hey, we sent a code to that email, and that's what you have to add here if you want to provide more details. And here, instead of a button sign in, confirm. On sign in, let's do on confirm. confirm your email, and here you'll press email code. One thing to note is that when we send this authenticate request to the server using the email token, we also have to specify the email. So one way would be to have a text input for the email on this page, but that wouldn't be very user-friendly because in the previous screen, he just wrote the email. So actually from the index, let me go back to the sign-in screen. And in the sign-in, what we want to do is the email that the user will write in this field, we want to send as a parameter to the next screen, so the next screen has access to it and doesn't ask the user one more time for the same email. So how do we do that? First of all, let's see how we can navigate from this screen to the second one. And I'm going to import use router from export router, and here we simply do router dot firstly we need access to this router, so at the top use router, and inside the on sign in function we can call the router dot push, and let's push the authenticate screen. So now if I press on the sign in here, we should be redirected to the authenticate, and now I can go back to this one and so on. But how do we send data there? Well, to send data, we can pass here, instead of a string, an object, and this string will become the path name. And the second parameter, we can add params here, and one of the params can be the email. Now we are sending this email there, but how do we get it in the next screen? In export router, we get that using the use search params from export router. So let's get the email from use search params. So here in authenticate, let's try to console log email and code. Now we are on the sign in page. If I write here ABC sign in, we are redirected to the next one. And here, if I will write 1, 2, 3, confirm, as you can see, the console log here is authenticate ABC 1, 2, 3, which means that at this moment in time, we have access both to the email and to the code. That's exactly what we will need here to authenticate and get back the authentication token. Okay, so far we have a user interface of authentication. Let me quickly git add, git commit of UI. Maybe not yet. I wanted to maybe update a bit the titles and the headers of these pages. So to do that, in the root layout, I'm going to add a new stack screen here. Stack.screen. The name is going to be the name of this route. So authentication is skipped because it's within parentheses, but in this case is sign in. So this way I can provide React navigation options to my sign-in screen, and for the sign-in I want probably to hide the header, so header shown false, and let me copy paste this one more time for the authenticate, and instead of hiding the header I'll provide a title confirm, I don't know, and if I refresh, it doesn't work. Oh, actually, it should be authentication /yes, because that's the name of it. It's not the path of the screen, but the name. So now the first one doesn't have a header. The second one is going to have a header with title confirm, and I can go back from there. Awesome. Now I can go ahead and commit. Okay, so once our user interface of our authentication screens is ready, let's go ahead and implement the backend requests that we're gonna need to interact with our backend. So for that, I'm gonna start with defining a new API library here for our authentication.ts. And here we're gonna have two functions. One of them is going to be the login function, which is async, and as a parameter it will receive an email, not email but data, which is going to contain the email. And the second function that we're gonna need here is the authenticate, which again is async. It will receive data, but in this case the data will contain both email string and also the email token string. Let's make sure that this data, email and email token, is the same as we have here, email and email token. Perfect. So let's go ahead and implement these things. What we will need here is the API URL. So let's import API URL from config, which is a file here with a URL. Now it's localhost, but if we're gonna host the backend, it's gonna be changed. And for the login, what we have to do, if we look in our backend, we have to send a post request to the /login page using the email, not page, but endpoint, using the email as the body. Okay, let's go ahead and do that. Response equal await fetch. What do we want to fetch? We want to fetch a combination, the API URL, then /authentication /login. I'm taking this one from this URL. And for the options, what do we need there? Well, first of all, let's provide the header with the content type, which should be application/JSON. And we don't need the authentication header here because these endpoints do not require the user to be authenticated yet. That's what we are doing this request. But what we need is the body. So the body, is it here? Yes, the body is going to be the JSON stringify version of our data that we receive as parameters data, like this. Okay, let's do some basic error checking, because if the response.status is different than 200, if there was an error, then let's go ahead and throw a new error. Errors during the login process. Otherwise, doesn't have to do anything. We are simply returning OK. Okay, let's copy the same logic in the authenticate because it's going to be pretty similar. So what we will do is we're going to do a fetch on the auth/authenticate. So if I look here, authenticate is going to be post request on the authenticate, email, and email token. And I think I forgot to send the method, should be post. And the same here for the second one, method post. So we stringify the data, we send it. If it's not 200, there was an error. Otherwise, let's go ahead and return the response JSON because it's important. It contains the authentication token. So let's return the response.json like this. Okay, so with the low-level logic of fetching our API, we are done, and we can move on to our screens. Let's go ahead in our authentication to the sign-in screen, and this is the first step. So what we have to do is we have to simply import this login function from our API and call it here when the user presses sign in. You can directly call that function here without any other additional libraries, but because in this project I'm using React Query, I'm going to continue using it for running this mutation as well. So I will simply have to import use mutation. React Query. Let's define the use mutation here. Simply provide the mutation function. It should be an object with mutation function. And the mutation function is going to be the one that we defined here in our library, login. So it should be login. You know what? Because we are going to... You forgot method post. Thank you very much. I'm thinking whether to use React Query for this process as well. Thinking that this video I want to release as a separate independent video. Okay, let's use it. Hopefully it's not gonna be too complicated, because at the same time, like for these two mutations, like it doesn't add a lot of value, and I would actually let me do it without React Query in order to make these passwordless authentication videos more generic, so anyone can implement in their stack. So what I'm gonna do is, continue without the React Query. So now in our sign-in function, let's go ahead and import the newly created login function from our library API authentication. And what we have to do is here on sign-in, we're going to call a login function, and we're gonna send the data with our email. Let's make sure to await. And because this login function can throw an error, we have to put it into a try catch. Try here. We're gonna put the router push in the try because we want to navigate to the second screen only if the login succeeds. And in the catch, we can catch the error, and simply using an alert, we can provide alert error, and we can do error.message. Make sure to import alert from React Native. I'm doing here very basic error handling using an alert, but you can save it into a state and display it on the user interface as well. So now in our application, if I'm going to use my email here, it actually redirected to the confirm page. And if I look at the backend in the logs, we see that right now, a couple of seconds ago, we received a new request and everything was successful. Okay, so let's do the same thing on the confirm page, on the authenticate page. And here in the confirm, what we have to do is we have to import the authenticate from our library, which is the function that which will call our backend, and inside our onConfirm function, let's go ahead and do a try catch first. Again, very basic alert error handling. Let's make sure to import alert from React Native. And inside this try, what we're going to do is we're going to call the authenticate method. We're going to send here the body containing the email and the email token. The email token, we're going to take it from the state. Here, TypeScript is complaining because this email from search params can be either string or undefined. So I can do a check here if type of email is different than a string. I can return here. And let's go ahead and console log the response to see what we get back. Okay, so if I press sign in here, we're redirected to the next page. If I do some kind of code, press confirm, email code doesn't match. But if I'm going to use the code that I received on email, which is this one, confirm, we didn't see the alert. And if I will look in the logs, we should see this log with the authentication token. And this is exactly the authentication token that we will need for next request to authenticate our request to our API. So that means that the whole flow now is connected and working properly, from creating an account and requesting a one-time password on our email to validating that password here on the second page and exchanging it to a JWT token. The only thing next is to save this JWT token somewhere, use it for the next requests, and also to manage the whole authentication flow and protect some of our application routes based on whether the user is authenticated or not. Okay, let me go ahead and git commit authentication backend integration. And our next step is going to be Our next step, let's see, give me just 1 second. Export router. The next step is to manage the authentication flows in our application and to protect our screens based on the authentication status of a user. So if a user is not authenticated, we should always redirect him to the sign-in page. And if a user is authenticated, we should redirect away from the sign-in page to the home screen, for example. And at the same time, protect the users from being able to navigate to the routes that he should not have access unless he is authenticated. So I will leave a couple of links to the guides of these authentication flows. So if you're using React Navigation, there is this guide for authentication flows that explains how you can display different screens based on the authentication status. But in our case, we are using Export Router, so we're gonna follow this guide for the authentication that will help us implement it using the Export Router. So I don't want to simply copy paste everything. I don't want to simply copy paste everything, so we're gonna develop it step by step together. So what we need first is a context that is going to contain data about our authentication status, which we will be able to use in all our screens to know, like, is the user authenticated or not. Let's go ahead and create a new folder, context, that will contain files with contexts. The first one is going to be auth context.tsx. Okay. First steps first is let's define this auth context using the create context function from React, like this. Now let's define a provider. So auth context provider is going to be a React component that will render the auth context.provider here, and inside of a provider we will render all the children that we will receive as the children of this auth context provider when we will encapsulate our screens with it. So children, we can do props with children, and here we can go ahead and render them here. The auth context provider expects a value which will represent like the actual value of our context. And what will we store in this auth context? Well, the most important thing is we're gonna store the token, the JWT token. So for that, we're gonna need a state variable for the auth token, set auth token, which is equal to use state, and initially is going to be null. This use state should be imported from React. So use state. And if we provide also types, it should be string or null. Let's go ahead and export this auth token as a value. And should we also export the set authentication token? Maybe. let's go ahead and set it, export it as well. Make sure to export this auth context provider component as default. So export auth context provider, and we need to do it by default. And what we're going to do with it, we're going to wrap our whole application inside this auth context provider. So in Export Router, that is going to be in our app layout file. And let's import auth context provider, and let's go ahead and wrap our whole application in auth context provider like this. Inside our root layout navigation. Now, in our authentication screens, specifically in our screen where we receive the JWT token, we should be able to update the authentication token from our context provider. Basically, we need to get access to this context and to call the set authentication token that we export here. What we will do to get access to this context is we're going to export a const, a custom hook called use authentication, which will help us get access to the context using the use context hook, and by providing this context, this specific context here. Use context hook is another hook that we need to import from React. And now, using this use authentication, we can get access to the set authentication token function inside our authenticate page. Here, the name of this function should be authenticate, actually. Export default authenticate. And using that hook, we can get access to equal use auth set auth token. So using this setter, we can go ahead and call set auth token with a response dot what's going to be the auth token. That's going to be the value of our response. That's what we saw in the logs. So let's go ahead in auth context and do a console log here to make sure that we are properly setting authentication token. So console.log auth token equal auth token. So now if we look in the logs, we should see, let me maybe clear. If I refresh, we should see auth token null because we are not yet signed in. That's okay. Let's go ahead and simulate a user creating a new account. For the confirm code, I'm going to take it from my email, confirm, and we see that it automatically updated the auth token in our context. And now it has an authentication token. Perfect. But at the same time, if we have an authentication token, that means that we are authenticated and we can safely redirect the user back to the home page, right? So how do we do that? Well, we will do that using some listeners and using some effects based on authentication token, and also based on the URL where the user is currently on. What I mean by that is, let's get the, how is it called? The segments of the path from export router, use segments from export router. It was imported automatically. And if I do console log here, segments, should be segment, you're gonna see what it contains. So this array contains the segments drawer, then tabs, then feed. It's basically all the parts of a URL that are separated by the slash. And in our project, that represents our directories. So as you can see, the drawer is drawer, then tabs, tabs, then feed, feed. If we are on the authentication page, this contains authentication, then sign in. So this is a way to understand on where the user currently is. So based on these two things, where the user is and whether he is authenticated or not, we can understand like if he is supposed to be there or not, or where he is supposed to be in terms of what screens. So let's do a use effect on that will always be executed when either the segment or the authentication token is going to update. To understand if he is currently on some screens that do not require authentication, basically is auth group, we can check if segments at position 0 is equal to authentication, to auth like this, because that's our first part of a segment for the authentication screens. Then what we can do is we can decide where the user should be. So if the user is not authenticated, so if authentication token is null and he is not in the authentication group, that means that he is on a screen that he is not supposed to see. In that case, what we should do is we should redirect him back to the sign-in screen. To redirect, we need access to the router. So use router from export router. And we're going to use not push, but router.replace, because we don't want him to be able to go back to some screens. So replace slash how is our authentication slash sign in. Otherwise, otherwise, if I can do another if statement here, but if he is authenticated, which means that he has an authentication token and he is in the authentication group, that means that he shouldn't be there. He should be on the home screen. So router.replace, and let's redirect him to the feed or even to the home screen like slash. But if we redirect to the slash, we should make sure to go to our index and define the home screen as the feed. It will still redirect back to the sign-in because we specified that. And we can have a look in our auth context and say console log user is not yet authenticated and he cannot see this page. So right now, if I'm gonna refresh the page and look into the logs, that's exactly what we see. User is not yet authenticated and he cannot see this page because the segments, if I will also run console log the segments, we would see that we were on the feed screen. But now, if I'm going to sign in by dim at notjust.dev, get the code, put the code here, and press confirm, now I'm redirected home. And how it happens? It happens because router replaces our screen with the slash, and in the slash, which is our index, redirects us to the feed. And now we cannot go back because we are already signed in. The thing is that if we refresh, we're still gonna go from the first part because we are not persisting the JWT token, our authentication token yet, but at least our authentication flow is working properly as we expect it to work. So when there is no authentication token and the user is not in the authentication group, we want him to redirect back to the sign-in page. And if he has an authentication token and he is still in the authentication group, we want to redirect him to the home page, to the home screen. So that's how we basically gatekeep different screens based on the authentication status of the user. So let me do git add, git commit of, how's it called? Protected routes. Okay. We have two more things to do. We have to, first of all, persist our authentication token. So the second time we're going to refresh the application, we're not going to have to go through the same process again. Our application will remember that, hey, the user was signed in and will write this authentication token in storage. To do that, we're going to use, we can use some libraries that will help us write on our device storage. We can use async storage, but that is not a secure way to store tokens. A better way would be to use Expo Secure Store, and this will allow to store data on the storage, which is encrypted. So to do that, we're gonna install firstly Expo Secure Store in our React Native application, npx expo install. And using the secure store.setItemAsync and getItemAsync, we're going to be able to write and get our authentication token. So where should that happen? That should happen in the authentication of context provider. And first of all, we need to save that token whenever we are updating it here. So instead of directly sending the set of token setter function, instead of exposing the set of token function here, what I will do is actually, let's go ahead and do update of token. This is going to be a function that will receive the new token as string, and we're gonna expose this update authentication token from here. We want to make sure that in our screen authenticate, we are not calling the set auth token, but update auth token. And in our auth context, what we want to do here is let's go ahead and first of all set it in state, set auth token in state. And also we want to save it on the device storage using secure store. So for that, we're going to import secure store. Not like this, like this. And yeah, besides saving it in state, we will also want to do await secure store.save set item async. Here we need to provide a key and a value. The key is going to be auth token, and the value is going to be new token. I'm thinking to do it the other way around, to first save it in on the device storage and then update it in state, because updating it in state will redirect the user. So yeah, let's make sure that first the token is saved and then it's redirected. And because this is an async function in the authenticate screen, we should also make sure to await here to update the authentication token. Perfect. The second step is reading this authentication token when the application mounts. So to do that, we're going to add a new use effect with an empty dependency list that will load the auth token. So load auth token is going to be an async function that should be called right away. And in this async function, let's do const response. As well, we're going to await the secure store using get method, and using the same key, we are going to be able to access it from the secure store. So what we can do is we can set backend state, set auth token as response. We can do a if statement to make sure like that it's available before we set it in state, like this. So now refreshing and possible unhandled rejection. Let's see why is that happening. Cannot read property get item async of undefined. I think I imported it incorrectly. Yes, I need to import everything as secure store from expo secure store. And now let's try to log in again. Sign in. Here, we're gonna receive a code on email. I already should have so many emails from this live stream. Confirm. We are redirected to the home screen, and hopefully we also persisted and saved the authentication token on the device storage. And if I refresh the application, if everything works, we should automatically be redirected to the feed. And that's exactly what happens. We are automatically redirected to the feed. So if I update refresh right now, we are back here. Perfect. So now the user will not have to always log in. He will log in once and the application will remember the authentication token and will use that authentication token for future requests. So let's go ahead and commit this. And the next step is going to be to actually make sure that our API is using the authentication token from the context provider, because right now, if we're looking in the config here, that was manually set here. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to remove this authentication token from here because it shouldn't be hard-coded. It should be taken dynamically. And let's think how we're going to get this data in our functions for the authorization. Because now we're not going to have access to this authentication token. So here, these are functions. We're not going to be able to get access to the context. So most probably the easiest way at this moment is to let me check. Can you access React context data from API functions? I don't know. React context outside of a component. Yeah, at the moment, this authentication token probably would have to be passed here to this function, or we can do another context that will provide these functions, and in that case, they will be components, so they will have access to the authentication token. Let me see. Let me think. Thank you for a 4-day masterclass. I'm very appreciative. Thank you very much for the kind words. So I'm thinking how would be the best way. So I have two options at the moment. Passing the authentication token through properties, through variables. But in that case, we would have to do that for every single query. And that's not very user-friendly. Or another way is to define them, to export this from another context that is going to have access to the authentication. Or I could always read it from the store, which is not something that I would like to do here as well, because it wouldn't be very efficient. Think, Vadim, think. So where do we, let me see, list tweets and so on. In the new tweet, yes, like here we can get that token. And we would have to pass it there. Okay, so look what we're gonna do. Because our API methods, they need access to authentication token. As I was saying before, we have two options of getting this authentication token in these functions. One of them is through parameters, because our authentication token is provided, is available through our auth context. So there is no easy way to get it directly here in the list tweets, because these functions are not as part of a React tree. They are being called from the React tree, and in that moment, for example, in the new tweet, here we would be able to get the authentication token and send it down to the create tweet function. But I really don't like this approach, because it will imply that every time we are using them, we are using mutations or queries, every time we would get the authentication token. So I think a better approach is to transform these functions into a React context as well. And this way the functions will have access to the authentication token themselves. So they will not depend on extra parameters. So let's see how we would do that. So first of all, let's say this is tweets API context. It's a create context. We're gonna create a context with create context. From here, let's go ahead and create that tweets API context provider. And this one is going to be a function that will receive children. And will return back the tweets API context dot provider. And yeah, let me close this one. It doesn't want to autocomplete because my file is not a TSX file, but it's a TS file. So I can rename it to TSX. tweet context provider. And here, let's go ahead and add the children. We need to provide the value here, and the children can be typed as props with children. Now, what we can do is, let's go ahead and bring all these functions. I'm gonna copy all of them. Let's bring it as part of this component. And because they are part of this component, we don't need the export from here. Like this. Now, because we are part of a React component, what we can do is we can use the authentication context, and we can get from there the auth token, like this, use auth. That is a context managing the authentication. And now our list tweets and so on, they will handle authorization themselves. And the last step is to go ahead and export them inside this value. So list tweets, get tweet, and get tweet, and also create tweet. So we are exporting this way via the functions. And lastly, I also want to export from here a helper hook. So const use tweet API that will get us access using the use context to this tweets API context. Like this. Now we need to wrap our application inside this tweets context provider. For that, we need to export it as default. Export default tweets context provider. And inside our layout, we're going to import similar way how we did for our authentication context for our tweets API context provider. And let's wrap it our screens in this tweets API context provider, but make sure that it's below the authentication context, because our API is dependent on the authentication token. So it's here. And let's go ahead in our application where we are using, for example, in the new tweet, instead of importing it like this from API tweets, we are going to import the use tweets API. And we are going to get access to that function, create tweet, from this use tweets API hook. Like this. And the same way in our drawer, for example, tabs feed index. Instead of getting list tweets from there, we're going to get use tweets API, and we're going to get access to the list tweets from the use tweets API. And same way as in the tweet, that's the last place. Instead of get tweet, and this way, it's loading. I think it's gonna fail, but we're gonna see why. Let's go ahead in our lib tweets tsx here and try to console log this auth token. So it's there, but it's still saying not authorized. Let's try to see if this token is actually working by calling list tweets and changing here the headers, the authorization header, send. It says 200, okay. Why might it not work? List tweets of token. So inside list tweets, it's null. Why is it null inside this function? Is it about to end? If I fix this issue, probably yes. But yeah, we still have a couple of features. Oh, why is the authentication token null here inside this function, list tweets? This function should be recreated whenever the authentication token changes. But they are somehow not recreated. Pass as params in function? What do you mean? This component should re-render every time authentication token re-renders, but for some reason the functions are not recreated whenever we do that, and they remain the same from the first time. So that's why it's available here, but not available here, because this function was created basically earlier and it's not updated. But why? List tweets. I can try use callback option. Use callback that also expects a parameter here, and I can add auth token to make sure that the list tweets function updates when the authentication token updates. It still doesn't work. I'm thinking whether it's not updating because I don't think like that's how it should work. But I'm thinking that it's not updating because this is not a local state. So it doesn't, but it should update because it's a different. So it's still updating actually. So I'm gonna do a test. Like, let's try to add a local auth token. Set local auth token. Use state nothing. Then in a use effect, so weird. We call this use effect whenever auth token is changed, so we can set local auth token with auth token. And now we can work with this auth token in the list. I don't need the callback because I see that it doesn't work. It's still the same. Yeah, Madi, but in that case, you'd have to send the authentication token, and I wanted specifically not to have to send it from outside. Why? That's hard. That's tough. And it becomes frustrating. Token inside API provider null, inside list tweets null. Wait a second. API provider null, inside list tweets null. Oh my god! It was doing these queries even before we load the authentication token. And because it was scheduling this request multiple times, it was always doing them with null. And until it reached the point where it was no longer doing these requests. So that's why in all of these functions, we should make sure to check, first of all, if the authentication token is there, and only then to fetch, otherwise to stop the fetching process. Like this. And yeah, I can go back to this structure. Again. Tweets data is undefined, but you should wait until look, if I'm gonna do it a bit differently. Like if authentication token is not here, no, I cannot do that. It does this request even before it has to do it. Tweets data is undefined. That should come somewhere from drawer tabs feed index, and tweets data is undefined. Yeah, I think I can do that. So in the, for example, in the drawer, thank you very much for the suggestion. In the drawer layout here, I know that all of these screens are screens that depend on the authentication token. So I can get the auth token from the use authentication. And as long as we don't have authentication token yet, I can return an activity indicator. In this way, we're not gonna even get there. And now when we get there, we know that we have an authentication token. And now it's working perfectly. Yes, okay, that's good. Whew, that was a bit complicated, but we finally managed to do it. But the complication was from the combination of all our ways we are querying our API. Okay, so let's go ahead and do git add, git commit -m of use token from context. All right, that was tough, but finally we managed to do it. And with that being said, everything that I have prepared for today is finished. Let me quickly do the outro for our authentication videos. Alright guys, so I hope you enjoyed this video where we implemented passwordless authentication flow, where the user is able to sign in our application using his email only. So it was quite a challenging process, but I hope you learned something new today. And if you enjoyed this, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell for not to miss any future videos that we're gonna make. All right, if you have any questions, guys, now is the time. Else, I'm gonna start preparing for the trip to Poland. And every time I go through these debugging sessions, which is quite annoying, especially during the live streams, it frustrates me, but I see a lot of comments like Sandile is saying, I know it's annoying, but glad to have seen the debugging session. And I saw that a lot of people are taking value out of these debugging sessions, but it's killing me. Thank you very much. All right, guys. So thank you very much for staying till the end. Stay tuned. We are going to announce the new project that we're going to do. If you want to see how you would deploy this backend to production, let me know in the comments. Maybe we can prepare something for that as well. Take care, stay hydrated, guys, and I will see you next week probably.